My name is Anna Carter, and if someone had told me 10 years ago that I would one day stand in my own Seattle apartment holding the keys that I bought with money earned from my own sweat and tears, I would have laughed in disbelief. Not because I lacked ambition, but because for most of my life I was treated as though I did not matter. I was the shadow in the Carter family, the daughter who was never celebrated, the one who was easy to dismiss. The black sheep standing against a wall decorated with certificates and awards that never bore my name. My parents, Richard and Elaine, were admired in our neighborhood. People whispered about their success, their wealth, the way their eldest daughter, Victoria, seemed to shine at every event. Outsiders believed I was blessed, lucky even, but no one ever saw the cold silence that wrapped around me at home. It was the kind of silence that carved holes in your chest, the kind that taught you early to lower your voice to make yourself smaller. I lived in a house full of pride, but that pride never included me. I learned what favoritism meant before I could spell the word. When Victoria smiled, the world bent toward her. When I smiled, no one noticed. And when the day came that my parents handed Victoria $600,000 for her wedding, while I received one single dollar pressed into my hand like a joke, I felt something inside me shatter. That moment was more than humiliation. It was confirmation. Confirmation that in my parents' eyes, my life, my dreams, my worth were valued less than a cheap cup of coffee. My hands trembled as I stared at that dollar bill. My mother Elaine's voice was flat, almost bored when she said it. "You already have your scholarship, Anna. Do not expect more." The guests at the table laughed at something Victoria's fiancé said. Crystal glasses clinked. My father Richard nodded in approval of his firstborn. I sat there in silence, my throat-dry rage pressing against my ribs. How do you describe the feeling of being erased by the very people who created you? It is like being alive at your own funeral. You sit in the same room, but you are invisible. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table to demand why my dreams were mocked while Victoria's were funded like royal decrees. But I stayed frozen, the single dollar burning in my palm. That was the moment everything changed. Not because they gave me so little, but because I finally understood that waiting for their love was a trap. My entire life had been spent chasing scraps of approval that never came. That night, in the quiet of my small rented room, I stared at the cracked ceiling and made a promise. If my family refused to see me, then the world would. If they refused to believe in me, I would believe in myself twice as hard. I remember standing by the window, the Seattle rain streaking down the glass neon lights, bleeding into puddles on the street. The city was alive, restless, unforgiving, and yet it welcomed me more than my own family ever had. I whispered to myself, I will not be erased. But courage is not a steady flame. It flickers. It trembles. One moment you are strong, the next you are broken. In the weeks after the wedding, I drifted between fury and despair. I replayed every word my parents had said, every smirk on Victoria's face, every chuckle from relatives who thought my pain was entertainment. My hands ached from clenching fists against my thighs. My eyes burned from holding back tears. Yet beneath the anger, something else was growing, a seed of defiance. I realized that my story would not end in their shadows. My story would not be a footnote under Victoria's spotlight. I was not born to be forgotten. That realization was terrifying because it meant I had to fight alone. But it was also liberating because for the first time I understood that my value could not be dictated by them. It would be written by me. And that is why I tell this story now, because the girl who received $1 at her sister's $600,000 wedding is no longer silent. She has scars, she has rage, but she also has resilience. And everything changed the moment I stopped begging for love that was never meant to be given. I grew up in a neighborhood that looked like a postcard, the kind of place where lawns stayed trimmed and neighbors waved as they drove luxury cars up their driveways. Our house was a white two-story colonial on a quiet cul-de-sac outside Seattle. From the outside, it looked perfect, but perfection is sometimes a costume-hiding rot. Inside, everything revolved around Victoria. She was 2 years older than me, my parents' golden child, their pride and joy. My father Richard boasted about her grades at dinner. My mother Elaine collected programs from her piano recitals and framed them on the walls. I was Anna, the other one, the quiet shadow trailing behind. I noticed it first when I was 6. It was Victoria's birthday party. The house smelled of frosted cake and barbecue smoke. Balloons brushed against the ceiling ribbons dangled from chairs. Victoria's friends squealed as she unwrapped a gleaming new pink bicycle with silver tassels hanging from the handlebars. My father clapped, my mother wiped tears of joy, cameras flashed. When my turn came a month later, I sat at the same table staring at a smaller cake with less frosting. My gift was a second-hand teddy bear missing one eye. No balloons, no cameras, just a distracted pat on the head. It seared into me even then that I was not worth celebrating. By the time I was 10, the pattern was carved in stone. Victoria wanted riding lessons, so my father paid without hesitation. She wanted a violin, so my mother called a private tutor. When I timidly asked for sketch paper, Elaine dismissed me with a sigh. Maybe next time, Anna, she muttered while stirring her tea. But next time never came. I remember sitting in the back seat of the family SUV on the way to vacation in Whistler. Victoria chatted excitedly about the ski slopes my parents promised her a brand new outfit from the resort shop. I pressed my face to the cold window silently, wishing we could stop at an art gallery in the city. No one heard me. My voice disappeared under the hum of the car engine and their laughter. At dinner tables, Victoria's achievements were announced like breaking news. She won a regional piano award. She scored high marks in science. My father's booming voice filled the dining room as relatives nodded with approval. I sat with peas on my plate, pushing them into patterns, waiting for a chance to mention that I won a small art contest at school. When I finally spoke, my mother said, "Oh, that's nice, dear," and immediately turned back to discuss Victoria's debate team. The humiliation was sharp like a slap in the dark. Even my birthdays carried reminders. One year, Victoria blew out candles on a towering cake layered with chocolate while I received a smaller, crumbling edge piece. I told myself not to care, but children always notice. They notice who is clapped for who is ignored. I noticed everything. The house was full of trophies, medals, plaques, all engraved with Victoria's name. My own drawings taped to the fridge for a day ended up in the trash by night. I once found one of my sketches of a sunset crumpled inside the kitchen bin, stained with coffee grounds. I pressed it flat with my hands, tears blurring the lines, and stuffed it inside my school notebook. That notebook became a secret vault of my worth. I remember nights lying in bed listening to the muffled sound of my parents and Victoria laughing downstairs. My ceiling became a canvas where I painted questions in my mind. Why not me? Why am I invisible? Did I do something wrong? The silence never answered. Instead, it grew heavier. It wrapped around me like chains. The first time my mother raised her hand at me, I was 11. I had spilled paint water on the kitchen counter while working on a school project. Elaine's face twisted, her voice sharp as she slapped me across the cheek. "Do not make a mess with your silly hobbies," she snapped. My cheeks stung. My eyes watered, but worse was the way Victoria smirked from the doorway. She had never been hit. She was untouchable. In that moment, I understood the rules of the Carter household. Victoria was celebrated. I was tolerated, and tolerance could vanish in an instant. Family vacations became theaters of comparison. If Victoria wanted kayaking, we were on Puget Sound by morning. If she wanted hiking, we were climbing Mount Rainier the next day. When I asked to see an art exhibit, my mother brushed me off. Maybe next time, Anna. But next time never came. At night, I sketched in secret hiding papers under my bed, shading lines with a flashlight while the house slept. I created worlds where I mattered. I painted myself standing tall, admired by crowds, respected by strangers. In my pictures, my parents smiled at me with pride. Deep down, I knew they never would, but the fantasy kept me alive. Even small moments confirmed my place. At school, pickup, Richard rushed to ask Victoria about her test scores. When I tried to speak, he cut me off. Later that night, he praised Victoria in front of the family, ignoring that I had also received good grades. Invisible became my identity. It seeped into my bones until I started to believe it. That belief twisted into a mix of shame and determination. Shame because I felt unworthy. determination because a quiet voice whispered that I had to find a way out. I began to realize that survival in this family meant building my own light. But when you are a child, dreams feel fragile. They can be crushed by a look, a laugh, a sigh. And my family was full of crushing. The more they lifted Victoria up, the smaller I felt. But inside, something stubborn flickered. Every slight, every dismissal, every bruise on my pride was fuel. Fuel for the girl they thought would fade into silence. I was 12 when I discovered what I wanted to become. It happened during a school trip to the Seattle Art Museum. While my classmates wandered noisily from gallery to gallery, I drifted into a side room where a woman stood carefully cleaning an old painting. She moved her brush like a surgeon, gently revealing blues and reds hidden beneath layers of grime. Watching her was like watching someone bring a forgotten soul back to life. My heart pounded with excitement. For the first time in my young life, I felt a calling, a vision of who I wanted to be. An art conservator, someone who could restore beauty where it had been neglected. That evening, I filled pages of my notebook with sketches of paintings I had seen my hand trembling with energy. For my 12th birthday, I asked for something simple, an art kit with paints and brushes, nothing extravagant. I imagined opening the box and smelling fresh colors dipping bristles into water, beginning the journey I had glimpsed at the museum. On the morning of my birthday, I tore through wrapping paper with my heart leaping. Inside was not an art kit, but a thick math workbook. "Practical, my mother," Elaine said flatly, already turning back to her medical charts. "Art is a hobby, Anna, not a future." My father did not even look up from his newspaper. Across the table, Victoria squealed as she unwrapped a brand new gaming console. The contrast felt like a knife. I smiled weakly, forced a thank you, and carried the workbook upstairs. That night, I shoved it under my bed and pulled out scraps of paper to sketch by lamplight. My chest burned with humiliation. It was not just disappointment, it was erasure. They had taken my dream and called it worthless. Weeks later, I gathered the courage to mention art restoration at dinner. "My teacher thinks I might have a talent," I began, my voice shaking. Before I could finish, Elaine cut me off without raising her eyes. "Art will not feed you, Anna. Be practical." My father muttered agreement. Victoria chuckled. "Maybe you can paint us all when we are famous doctors." The table erupted in laughter except for me. I sat frozen, my cheeks hot peas cold on my plate. I swallowed my pride and told myself not to cry in front of them. But inside, something snapped. Their rejection was not ignorance. It was deliberate. They wanted me small, obedient, invisible. I realized then that my dream would survive only if I protected it myself. I began hiding my sketches drawing late into the night, saving pennies to buy cheap pencils from the corner store. Each stroke of graphite was an act of defiance. The rejection turned into fuel, though it was bitter fuel. Sometimes I stared at the math workbook under my bed, its spine, stiff pages unmarked. It was a symbol of their dismissal, a reminder that in their eyes I was meant to calculate equations, not create beauty. I hated that book with a quiet, burning hatred. It whispered their contempt each time I glanced at it. Yet alongside the anger grew determination. If they would not believe in me, I would believe in myself twice as much. I began studying art books from the library, copying paintings, experimenting with colors. The smell of paint on my fingers became my secret badge of survival. Even at 13 and 14, I knew this path would not be easy, but I also knew it was mine. My parents' rejection carved scars, but scars can be reminders. Each scar told me to keep going, to fight for a future beyond their narrow vision. When the walls of my parents' house pressed in too tightly and the silence of indifference grew unbearable, there was one place where I could breathe. It was the small cottage of my grandmother Margaret Dawson, my mother's mother, who lived in Portland. Her house smelled of old books and lavender, the kind of smell that made you feel safe the moment you stepped inside. Unlike the Carter home, nothing in her place was polished or staged for display. The furniture was worn but warm, the shelves lined with vinyl records, the garden blooming in wild disorder. Grandma Margaret saw me, really saw me in a way my parents never did. I was 14 the afternoon she called me into her kitchen where rain pattered softly against the window. She handed me a small box wrapped in faded floral paper. I peeled it back carefully, unsure what to expect. Inside was a modest art kit, brushes, slightly frayed tubes of paint that had already been opened a sketch pad with yellowing pages. My breath caught as I lifted it from the box. Grandma's eyes softened. "You have a gift, Anna," she whispered. "Do not let anyone tell you it is not enough." Her words were gentle, but they struck like thunder. For the first time in my life, an adult looked at me and spoke belief instead of dismissal. I hugged her so tightly I feared I might break her frail shoulders. That kit became my lifeline. Whenever the weight of my parents' rejection crushed me, I escaped to her cottage. We would sit on the back porch, the smell of roses rising from her garden, while I sketched the twisting vines and peeling paint of her fence. She never judged, never compared me to Victoria, never asked why my drawings were not practical. She simply nodded with quiet pride and told me to keep going. In that house, I was not invisible. I was Anna, an artist in the making. I remember one evening sitting at her round oak table while she brewed chamomile tea. The record player spun a scratchy tune in the background. "Tell me about your week," she said. I confessed that my parents had mocked me again at dinner, dismissing my small victory at school. Her face tightened with sadness, but she reached across the table and took my hand. "They are wrong," she said firmly. "You are not wrong for wanting something different. You are brave for dreaming." I stared at her weathered hand, covering mine warmth, seeping into my skin, and felt the sting of tears. No one had ever defended my dreams before. In those moments with her, I began to rebuild pieces of myself. She told me stories of her own youth, of how she had once loved literature, but had been forced into early marriage, her choices stolen by expectations. "I see myself in you," she admitted quietly. "Do not let them steal what they stole from me." That warning settled deep in my bones. Every time I picked up the brush she gave me, I felt her belief steadying my hand. At school, I worked harder, driven not just by stubbornness, but by the knowledge that at least one person thought I mattered. Even when my parents ignored me, even when Victoria sneered, I carried Grandma Margaret's words like armor. "You have a gift. Do not let them take it." That phrase echoed in my head on sleepless nights, turning despair into defiance. The cottage became my sanctuary. The scent of lavender, the hum of old records, the creak of the wooden porch boards. These details anchored me when the storm at home threatened to drown me. I sometimes feared what would happen when she was gone, when her voice was no longer there to remind me. But for those years, she was the light cutting through my family's darkness. And because of her, I held on to my dream with both hands no matter how hard my parents tried to crush it. When college applications arrived, the divide in our household widened into a canyon that could no longer be ignored. Victoria, already polished in her private school uniforms, had tutors arriving 3 evenings a week. My parents toured Ivy League campuses with her snapping photos of her in front of Gothic towers and manicured lawns. They paid thousands for test prep courses, confident that she was destined for greatness. I sat alone in my room with second-hand textbooks filling out applications to state schools with art programs leaning on scholarships I was not sure I could win. No one offered to help. When I finally received my acceptance letter from Washington State University with a scholarship for art restoration, I rushed into the living room waving the letter like a victory flag. "I got in," I said breathlessly. My mother glanced up from her coffee, her tone flat. "That is nice, Anna." My father did not lift his eyes from the newspaper. "Did you hear Victoria aced her AP exams?" The letter shook in my hand, their words slicing sharper than any blade. I retreated to my room and buried my face in the pillow, tears soaking into the fabric. That night, through sobs, I made another promise. I would prove them wrong. On the day I left for college, my suitcase was filled with thrift store clothes and a battered old laptop. My parents claimed their hospital shifts were too demanding to drive me. I stood on the curb with my bag when a familiar old hatchback pulled up. Grandma Margaret stepped out, her silver hair glinting in the morning sun. She wrapped me in her arms and pressed an envelope into my hand. It held a check not life-changing, but enough to cover my first semester's books. More important than money was her belief. "You are going to shine, Anna," she whispered. "Do not ever let them dim that." I clutched her words like armor as she drove me to campus. College was freedom braided with struggle. My scholarship covered tuition, but food rent and supplies were on me. I worked nights at a campus coffee shop wiping tables until my feet ached, then dragging myself back to study under dim light. Some nights, dinner was nothing more than instant noodles. I whispered prayers that my laptop would not die in the middle of a project. Yet when I stepped into the art studio, the exhaustion fell away. The smell of varnish, the sight of brushes lined in rows, the thrill of coaxing color back from a cracked canvas filled me with life. It was as if I was restoring myself stroke by stroke. On weekends, I haunted museums, peppering staff with questions. Every answer fed my fire. Every painting reminded me that beauty could survive neglect, that maybe so could I. Still, the comparisons never ceased. While I scraped dishes at midnight, Victoria posted pictures of her summers in Europe, trips my parents paid for without blinking. They funded her apartment in New York when she briefly studied abroad. I pieced together rent by sharing a cramped room with 2 other students. When I called home, excited about my first internship at a small Seattle museum cataloging artifacts and sweeping dusty floors, my mother's voice was cold. "That is nice, Anna. Did you know Victoria has been accepted to speak at a medical conference?" My knuckles turned white around the phone. "That is great," I whispered and hung up. In the cracked ceiling of my dorm room, I saw the shape of my anger. It was no longer just neglect, it was deliberate exclusion. But I kept going. The only thing that stitched me back together were Grandma's letters. They arrived in looping handwriting filled with stories of her garden or her book club drama. Sometimes she tucked a few dollars inside, enough for groceries. Always there were words of encouragement. "You are doing what you love, Anna," she wrote once. "That is more than most can say. Do not let anyone steal that joy." Her letters were a lifeline, proof that I was not crazy, that someone out there believed. By my final year, I finally got to work on a real project restoring a faded landscape from the 1800s. For weeks, I hovered over the canvas, carefully coaxing greens and blues back to life. Each brushstroke felt like unearthing a buried truth. I wanted desperately to share it with my parents. One evening, I called my father. "Dad, I am restoring a piece from the 1800s. It is incredible work." He cut me off. "Sounds like a lot of work for not much pay." My throat tightened. I did not call again. Graduation was supposed to be triumph. I walked across the stage with my diploma, scanning the crowd. My parents sat stiffly, expressions flat, attending out of obligation. At dinner afterward, in a generic chain restaurant, my father asked, "So, Anna, what is next?" I straightened my shoulders. "I got a job offer at a museum in Seattle. It is entry level, but it is a start." He frowned. "Seattle is expensive. How much does it pay?" I mumbled the modest salary. Their faces sank with disappointment. Across the table, Victoria spoke of her medical school interviews, their eyes lighting up at her every word. My victory shrank into failure under their gaze. Outside, Grandma caught me before I left. She pressed another envelope into my palm. "Do not let them dull your spark, my girl," she whispered. Inside was enough for a deposit on a tiny Seattle apartment. I hugged her with tears stinging my eyes. "I will make it work," I promised. And for the first time, I truly believed I could. Seattle was both a battlefield and a sanctuary for me. My new job at the museum was not glamorous. Most days, I cataloged dusty records, cleaned frames, and carried boxes heavier than I was. The pay barely covered rent and groceries, but I woke every morning grateful that I was surrounded by art. Yet the loneliness pressed in like a weight. I had poured myself into work for so long that I had not noticed how starved I was for someone to truly see me. That changed the day Daniel Miller walked into my life. It was a rainy Tuesday, and I was hunched over a corner table in a Capitol Hill coffee shop, sketching on scrap paper during my short break. The air smelled of espresso and cinnamon rolls, the windows fogged from the steady drizzle outside. Across the room sat a man with a laptop and headphones hanging lopsided around his neck. When the barista mixed up our orders, he carried the latte to my table with an apologetic grin. "Looks like fate wanted us to swap," he said. I smiled for real for the first time in weeks. We talked for an hour that day, 3 hours the next. Daniel was a web designer trying to build his own client list. He was not rich, not polished, but he was alive with ideas. His parents had worked in a Tacoma shipyard and he carried their grit in his bones. He knew what it meant to start from nothing. For the first time, I did not feel like I had to apologize for my dreams. Daniel understood the hunger and exhaustion of chasing something others dismissed as impossible. Together, we were underdogs, and together we were unstoppable. Within months, he became my anchor. When I dragged myself home after late shifts, he cooked pasta and made me laugh. When I doubted myself, he reminded me that resilience was stronger than privilege. After a year of dating, he asked if he could meet my family. My chest tightened at the thought. Every instinct screamed no. I pictured my parents' tight smiles, the cutting questions, the dismissive glances. But Daniel, ever hopeful, believed maybe they just needed to see what I saw in him. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Their dining room was pristine silver-polished chandelier light bouncing off white walls. Victoria lounged like a queen at the table, smirking when Daniel pulled out a chair for me. My father leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "So, Daniel, what is your 5-year plan?" Daniel steadied himself, his hand finding mine under the table. "I am building my client list," he said calmly. "It is slow, but every month gets better." My mother's voice cut in cold and precise. "And your income, can it support a family?" Heat rushed to my cheeks. "Mom," Daniel squeezed my hand. "It is okay, Nora," he said softly before meeting her gaze. "I am not where I want to be yet, Dr. Carter, but I am working hard. I believe in what I am building." The interrogation went on like that, question after question, each one a veiled insult. By dessert, the spark in Daniel's eyes had dimmed, though he never let go of my hand. I wanted to scream that this man saw me more clearly than they ever had, but my fury stayed locked behind clenched teeth. As we left, my mother pulled me aside. Her voice dropped to a whisper sharp enough to slice. "Do not tie yourself to someone going nowhere, Anna. You already chose a tough career. Do not make it worse." The words lodged in me like a splinter. Daniel was not the problem. They were. 6 months later, when Daniel proposed with a simple ring under the Seattle skyline, I did not hesitate. We had no illusions of grandeur. Our savings barely stretched far enough for a modest ceremony at a community center with fairy lights strung by friends and a homemade cake. It would not be lavish, but it would be ours. The Carter family wedding was the event of the season. Everyone in our community knew about it months in advance. Invitations printed on thick ivory paper arrived tied with golden ribbon. The venue was one of Seattle's most extravagant ballrooms, a hall with chandeliers glittering like constellations and marble floors polished to mirrors. Guests whispered about the rumored $600,000 budget, about the designer dress Victoria had chosen from New York, about the imported wine that would flow through the night. My parents beamed as if they had secured royalty. Victoria walked through the preparations like a queen inspecting her kingdom. I stood at the edges, ignored, watching mountains of flowers arrive, hearing caterers rattle off endless lists of delicacies, the air thick with the scent of garlic bread and butter sauces. Every detail screamed opulence. It was a stark reminder of where my family chose to pour their love and their money. When I arrived on the evening of the rehearsal dinner, the ballroom smelled of champagne and roses, the chandeliers blazing against the high ceiling. Guests filled tables draped in silk. I wore a thrifted dress ironed carefully but modest, feeling like a trespasser in a kingdom that had never been mine. Daniel squeezed my hand as we entered, whispering that I looked beautiful. His words steadied me, though my stomach churned. At the head table, Victoria sat with her fiancé, radiant in her designer gown. My parents flanked them, proud smiles plastered across their faces. Plates of steak and salmon were served, wine glasses refilled endlessly. I kept my eyes down, swallowing the lump in my throat as I listened to the laughter rising from their end of the room. After the main course, my father stood to toast. He spoke at length about Victoria's brilliance, about how proud they were to gift her this celebration. He boasted of the sacrifices they had made to ensure she would have her dream wedding. The room erupted in applause. My chest tightened as I thought of the nights I ate ramen alone in my dorm room, of the shifts I worked until my legs ached. When the applause faded, my mother Elaine turned toward me. Her face was smooth, almost blank, as she slid a small envelope across the table. "Here, Anna," she said. "We did not forget you." My heart skipped. For a brief, foolish second, I thought perhaps they had seen me at last, that maybe even now they could acknowledge I was part of this family. My fingers trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside was a $1 bill. One. My throat closed. The chatter of the room dulled into a distant roar. I stared at that dollar until the edges blurred. Around me, the table buzzed with conversation, oblivious or unwilling to notice the cruelty. Daniel's hand tightened around mine. My mother's voice cut through. "You already have your scholarship, Anna. Do not expect more." Victoria laughed lightly, clinking glasses with her fiancé. A cousin leaned over to glance at my envelope and smirked before turning away. My skin burned with humiliation. I wanted to disappear under the table. I wanted to scream, to fling the dollar back at their faces, to demand how they could value me at less than a cheap cup of coffee. Instead, I sat, frozen rage rising in my chest like fire trapped in glass. The orchestra played softly, violins threading through the air. Guests stood to dance under the chandeliers. I remained seated, my hands clenched in my lap. Daniel whispered, "We can leave if you want." I shook my head, though tears pricked my eyes. Leaving would feel like surrender. I forced myself to watch as Victoria twirled across the dance floor, silk gown, flowing photographers snapping pictures. My parents glowed with pride, oblivious to the storm inside me. Hours later, as we stepped into the cold Seattle night drizzle misting against my skin, I finally let the tears fall. Daniel wrapped his arms around me, his breath warm against my hair. "They will never change," he murmured. "But you do not need them." I wanted to believe him, but the wound was deep. That $1 was more than an insult. It was a verdict. It told me that in my parents' eyes, my worth would never rise beyond nothing. For days afterward, I carried it in my pocket, the paper crumpling with every touch a cruel reminder. Yet beneath the humiliation, something hardened. I realized that if I kept silent, I would drown. If I wanted to survive, I would have to fight. That night at the wedding was supposed to bury me. Instead, it planted the seed of defiance that would one day burn through everything they had built. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, violins weaving melodies through the air, laughter swelling as champagne flowed, but inside me everything had gone silent except the pounding of my heart. That $1 still lay in my palm, crumpled and damp from my clenched fist, a symbol of everything I had endured. I felt Daniel's hand squeeze mine under the table, grounding me, as my body trembled with rage and humiliation. My parents carried on as if nothing had happened, smiling at Victoria, their voices rich with praise, while I sat burning under the weight of invisibility. It might have stayed that way, another wound swallowed in silence, if not for the sound of a cane tapping sharply against the polished marble floor. Grandma Margaret rose slowly from her seat near the back, her silver hair catching the chandelier light. Conversations halted, forks hovered in midair, heads turned. Though her frame was small, her presence filled the room. "Enough," she said, her voice clear, louder than I had ever heard it. The air seemed to freeze. My mother stiffened, color draining from her face. "Mother, please, sit down," she hissed, but Grandma raised her hand and the command cut the air like glass. "No," she said firmly. "I will not sit and I will not be silent. I have watched this family tear Anna down for years, and tonight I am ashamed." A hush spread through the hall. My father's jaw clenched, his voice cold. "Mother, you are overreacting." "I am not." Her cane struck the floor, once sharp as a gavel. "Do not you dare deny it, Richard. I was there when you dismissed her dreams. I was there when you poured money into Victoria and told Anna her art was nonsense. I was there when you mocked her choices, belittled her work, humiliated her at this very table. I am old enough not to care what anyone thinks, and I will speak the truth." Gasps rippled across the room. Aunts shifted uncomfortably, cousins exchanged glances. Some looked guilty, some nodded. My mother tried again, her voice icy. "We have always treated our daughters equally." Grandma's eyes blazed. "Equally? Do not insult me, Elaine." You gave Victoria $600,000 for this wedding, and you handed Anna a single dollar. You think no one noticed? I noticed. The whole room noticed. Pride without love is nothing. Nothing. The words struck like thunder. I felt tears sting my eyes, not from pain, but from the shock of being defended, truly defended for the first time in my life. My father's face hardened. You are embarrassing yourself, Mother. No, she snapped. You are embarrassing yourselves, pretending this family is fair when it is not, pretending you are proud parents when you abandoned one of your own. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the faint clink of a glass set down too hard. Victoria crossed her arms, smirking. Jealousy has always been Anna's problem, she sneered. Grandma's gaze cut to her. Do not you dare. This is not jealousy. This is cruelty, and I will not watch it any more. For once, Victoria faltered, her smirk slipping. Daniel squeezed my hand harder, whispering, You are not alone. My chest swelled with something I had never felt in that family before, the strength of someone standing beside me without shame. For years I had carried the weight of silence. Now the silence was theirs. Around the room, relatives murmured, some nodding in agreement, others avoiding my eyes. Aunt Betty looked at me with soft sympathy. The power shifted in that moment. The truth had been spoken in public and could not be taken back. I straightened my shoulders, my voice shaking but louder than I expected. I am done, I said. My words echoed under the chandeliers. My parents stared at me as if I had struck them. I did not wait for their reply. I grabbed Daniel's hand and walked out of the ballroom, each step lighter than the last, though adrenaline made my chest quake. Behind me, I heard Grandma's cane tap defiantly against the marble, her voice carrying one final truth. Anna deserves better. She always has. The doors closed behind us, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The night we left the ballroom, the Seattle air felt sharp against my skin. Rain misting down in thin silver threads, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement. My hand clutched Daniel's as if it were the only anchor I had left. My chest still shook with adrenaline, but inside, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer the invisible daughter. I had been seen, and more importantly, I had spoken. In the days that followed, I cut off all contact. I blocked my parents' numbers, ignored Victoria's smug texts, and shut out the noise. At first, the silence was terrifying, like stepping into a void. Then slowly it became liberating. Grandma Margaret visited often, her cane tapping softly across my apartment floor, her eyes warm with pride. One afternoon, she placed a thick envelope on my table. It was her will, she explained, updated and signed with a lawyer's seal. The cottage in Portland, the savings she had guarded carefully for decades, the assets she still held in trust, all of it would come to me. My throat tightened. Grandma, I whispered, I do not deserve this. She squeezed my hand. You deserve more than they ever gave you. You deserve a chance to build without chains. Tears blurred my vision. I promised her I would honor it, but the Carters did not let go easily. When they learned of the new will, their fury was volcanic. My father stormed into my apartment uninvited, his voice booming. How dare you manipulate your grandmother, he spat. That house belongs to this family. My mother stood behind him, her eyes cold with contempt. Give it back, Anna, she snapped. You cannot take what is meant for Victoria. My blood boiled. For once I did not shrink. I faced them with my shoulders square. I did not manipulate anyone. Grandma chose me because you abandoned me. She saw what you refused to see. My father raised his hand as if to strike, but Daniel stepped between us, his voice steel. Do not touch her. My father's face twisted, but he lowered his arm, muttering threats as they stormed out. Days later, legal papers arrived, their attempt to contest the will. But Grandma was not naive. She had prepared evidence long before. She had recorded conversations, saved letters, gathered proof of years of favoritism and financial abuse. She handed it all to her lawyer, who summoned the family to a formal reading. The room was crowded with relatives, some curious, some hostile. My parents sat stiffly, Victoria beside them with her arms crossed her chin high. The lawyer opened a folder and began to read. He recited the details of the estate, the transfer of the cottage and funds to me, the exclusion of Richard Elaine and Victoria due to documented misconduct. Gasps filled the room. My father's face reddened, my mother's lips thinned. Victoria's smirk wavered. Then the lawyer pressed a button on a small recorder. The room filled with my parents' own voices, dismissing me, mocking my choices, boasting about funneling money to Victoria while denying me basic support. The words were sharp, undeniable. Next came photographs, emails, bank statements showing how funds meant for family expenses had been redirected to cover Victoria's tuition, her luxury vacations, her wedding. The evidence painted a damning picture. Relatives shifted uncomfortably, whispers rising. Aunt Betty's eyes met mine with quiet sympathy. Cousins looked at my parents with disgust. My father slammed his fist on the table. "This is a farce," he growled. The lawyer remained calm. "This is the truth, Mr. Carter, and it is legally binding." My mother hissed. "You will regret this, Anna." I met her gaze, my voice steady. "No, you will." For once, the power was not theirs. It was mine. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the extended family and into the community. My parents, once admired for their success, now faced whispers of shame. Neighbors who had envied their wealth now shook their heads at the scandal. Victoria's friends distanced themselves, uncomfortable with her arrogance exposed. The empire of prestige they had built cracked under the weight of truth. Meanwhile, I took possession of Grandma's cottage. It was old, creaking, in need of repairs, but it was mine. Daniel and I spent weekends painting walls, pulling weeds, fixing the roof. Each nail hammered felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. We invited Grandma to stay, her laughter filling the rooms that had once felt so empty. For the first time, I had a home not built on conditional love, but on choice and effort. The revenge was not loud or violent. It was public and undeniable. They had tried to erase me, and now they were the ones erased from Grandma's legacy. Still, they did not give up. Victoria confronted me at the cottage one evening, her designer heels sinking into the dirt path. "You stole this from me," she spat. "You have always been jealous." I laughed bitterly. "Jealous? You were handed everything, and you call me jealous because I earned something you could not steal." Her face twisted with rage. "You think you won." I leaned against the porch rail, calm. "I did not win, Victoria. I survived. That is something you never had to learn." She left in a storm of anger, her threats echoing, but I no longer feared her. The balance had shifted permanently. At night, I sat on the porch with Daniel and Grandma, the air scented with roses and rain, the sound of crickets in the garden. I thought of the ballroom of the single dollar that once burned in my palm, and I realized it had lost its power. My family's cruelty had been dragged into the light, their reputations shattered. The little girl who once hid sketches under her bed was gone. In her place stood a woman who refused to be silenced again. The months after the legal battle felt like the first breaths of air after being held underwater for too long. The noise from my parents and Victoria faded into background static, their threats empty, their reputations fractured. For years, I had begged for scraps of attention, twisting myself into someone they might finally recognize. Now the cord was cut. It hurt like tearing flesh from bone, but the relief that followed was undeniable. My life was no longer measured by their cold glances or cutting words. For the first time, I could build a life of my own choosing. Seattle became my sanctuary. Daniel and I rented a small apartment in Capitol Hill, sunlight streaming through tall windows, hardwood floors, worn but charming. There was even a corner nook I claimed as my art space brushes and half-finished sketches scattered across the table. At night, the sound of rain tapped against the glass, the city lights glittering beyond, reminding me of how far I had come from the lonely girl staring at the ceiling of her childhood bedroom. Daniel's laughter filled the rooms, his warmth wrapping around me like a blanket against the chill of old wounds. Grandma Margaret often stayed with us, her presence steady and comforting. She would sit by the window with tea, watching the rain streak down, smiling at the sight of us bustling in the kitchen. "You have built something real here," she told me once, her hands warm around mine. "Not everyone can say that." Her words sank into me deeper than any praise I had ever craved from my parents. Aunt Betty drove up from Portland, often bringing stacks of books from her shop, her hugs smelling faintly of cinnamon. "I should have spoken sooner," she admitted one evening. "I saw what they were doing to you, but I stayed quiet. I am sorry for that." I shook my head with tears blurring my eyes. "You are here now. That is enough." Slowly my circle widened. Cousins I had barely spoken to reached out, some admitting they had seen the favoritism, others offering encouragement. It was not a tidal wave, but it was enough to remind me that family is not defined by blood alone. Family is who stands with you when the storm hits. Our apartment became that sanctuary. On weekends, we cooked big dinners, the smell of garlic and basil filling the air, laughter spilling from mismatched chairs. Daniel would snap photos of me laughing with Grandma and Aunt Betty in the background, lamplight glowing golden over all of us. Later, I would look at those pictures and feel something I had never felt at the Carter dinner table piece. One night, I posted one of the photos with a caption, "New home, true family, grateful for those who have been here through it all." As I hit post, a calm washed over me. Not defiance, not bitterness, just peace. Calls from my parents still came buzzing my phone at odd hours, but I never picked up. Occasionally, Daniel would glance at the screen and ask, "Do you want to answer?" I always shook my head. No, not anymore. I was no longer interested in apologies wrapped in excuses. I was no longer interested in bargaining for love that should have been given freely from the beginning. For the first time in my life, I did not need their approval. The cottage in Portland became part of our rhythm, too. Daniel and I spent weekends there painting walls, repairing floors, planting flowers in the garden alongside Grandma. Each nail hammered, each weed pulled felt like a reclamation. What had once been a symbol of loneliness was now alive with love and laughter. On warm evenings, we sat on the porch, fireflies flickering, the scent of roses drifting Daniel's arm around me as Grandma hummed softly. The house that once belonged to my grandmother now belonged to all of us, a chosen family forged through pain but built on truth. One evening, as we sat at the small kitchen table, mismatched cups before us, Grandma looked at me with misty eyes. "You know, Anna," she said quietly, "you have already done what I never could. You walked away from people who wounded you even though they share your blood. That takes courage most never find." I pressed her hand and whispered, "I only did it because you showed me it was possible to be loved without conditions." She smiled, though sadness lingered in her gaze. In that moment, I understood that I had inherited more than a cottage. I had inherited her resilience, her quiet strength, her belief in love without conditions. My life no longer felt like a struggle for recognition. It felt like a life I had chosen, imperfect but real. On a rainy night in November, Daniel knelt in our living room, a simple silver ring in his hand, his eyes steady. "I want to build this life with you," he said. Tears filled my eyes as I whispered yes. Our wedding was nothing like Victoria's spectacle. It was held at a small community center, fairy lights strung by friends, cupcakes baked by neighbors, wildflowers arranged in thrifted vases. It cost a fraction of her extravagance, but every detail carried love. When I walked down the aisle toward Daniel, surrounded by people who chose to be there out of love, I felt richer than I ever had. My parents were not there. Neither was Victoria. And for once, their absence did not ache. It was a blessing. My vows trembled with emotion but rang with truth. I vowed never to let the wounds of my past define me, never to let cruelty silence me again. As Daniel slipped the ring on my finger, applause and laughter filled the room, and I felt free. That night, as rain tapped the windows and pasta simmered on the stove, we sat at our mismatched table. Grandma humming Aunt Betty telling book club stories, Daniel's hand warm over mine. My heart felt full, overflowing in a way it never had at any Carter holiday. This was my family, not the one I was born into, but the one I chose, the one that chose me back. I had fought for this against years of silence, against cruelty disguised as jokes, against the gnawing ache of being invisible. And now, sitting in that golden lamplight, I realized I had finally won. Family is not the people who share your blood. It is the people who show up who believe in you, who love you without keeping score. And as I looked around that table, laughter bubbling, rain singing against the glass, I knew I was finally home.